Thanks for tuning in. Be sure to subscribe to Cheating Stories Bests so you never miss out on our latest episodes. Today, we have a story that might hit close to home for some of you. Did my wife agree to an open relationship without telling me? Sit back, relax, and enjoy the show. It all began with a subtle shift, something I should have noticed but didn't until it was too late. Marcy and I were happily married, or so I thought. I guess I was too trusting, assuming everything was as it seemed. Maybe I should have paid more attention to the signs, but like many who are content with their lives, I chose to ignore them until they hit me hard. I'm Rick, 48 years old, and my wife Marcy is 47. Our house has felt empty for a while now, ever since our youngest son, Kyle, left for college upstate. Our daughter Rhonda, at 20, is busy with her own life. I'm a retired Army colonel, trying to adjust to civilian life after nearly 30 years in the service. We're the Westons, and our lives had been relatively smooth until recently. We were at a party in the Goldsteins' backyard, and Marcy was enduring Chuck Marston's endless chatter. Chuck was probably trying to impress her with his muscles rather than his conversation. Marcy rolled her eyes and gave me the classic save me signal by scratching her nose. I was engaged in a lively conversation with Jenny, a single mother who had shed some extra pounds and was now quite fit. She was talking my ear off about fitness, while I tried to pay attention to her. I noticed Marcy's subtle plea for help and, with a smile, took Jenny's hand. "Let's go rescue Marcy," I said, leading Jenny over to where Marcy and Chuck were standing. Jenny followed me, albeit puzzled about why I was introducing her to my wife. "Chuck, do you know Jenny?" I asked, extending my hand for a shake. Chuck looked momentarily confused but managed to recover and shake Jenny's hand. I used this opportunity to intervene and save Marcy from Chuck's relentless attention. Marcy gave me a far from thrilled look. "Thanks for the rescue, hero," she said, though her tone made it clear she wasn't thrilled. "It took you long enough. And by the way, you do know Jenny's assets aren't real, right? Considering how much I paid for mine, I think I'd know." I just shrugged. "Let's head home," I suggested. "We have an early flight tomorrow." As we made our way to the gate, we passed a young couple, Vincent and Leslie. Vincent gave me a nod, making way for us, while Leslie smiled politely. We had previously exchanged pleasantries with them, so it was a simple farewell. However, I couldn't shake the odd feeling I had from Leslie's gaze. It was as if she was eyeing me like a predator sizing up its next meal. My years in intelligence had made me overly cautious, always on the lookout for hidden agendas. But I pushed the thought aside, following Marcy out of the airport. Being separated was nothing new for us. My military career meant long absences, including a year in Korea that nearly ended our marriage. We had even had a major fight in Hawaii, which almost led to divorce. The stress of military life and frequent separations took their toll. Still, I considered us lucky to be together, despite the challenges. It wasn't until recently that I began to question Marcy's fidelity. During my deployment, she and the kids had moved back to our hometown. Marcy got a job at a local hospital, conveniently near a hotel where my high school ex-girlfriend, Lydia, worked as a manager. Lydia spotted Marcy in the hotel's parking lot and informed me. At first, I dismissed it, but then I hired a private investigator to follow Marcy. The report came back, and I felt foolish for not putting two and two together sooner. The hospital parking lot was under construction, so Marcy had to park at the Red Roof Hotel, where many of the staff did the same. The issue was that Marcy always arrived a couple of hours early for her shifts, something that only stopped when I returned home. If Marcy was seeing someone, it wasn't something I could ignore any longer. The pieces were starting to fit together, but the full picture remained unclear. As I pondered our situation, I couldn't help but wonder if I had been blind to the signs all along. What do you think about today's story? Was Rick right to question his wife's fidelity? Leave your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more intriguing stories. See you in the comments. I couldn't shake the uncertainty that had taken root in my mind. Lydia's words left me torn between doubt and hope. Whether she was right or wrong, they made me confront a harsh reality. I realized that my neglect of Marcy had left a dangerous opening. As I thought about the possibility of her leaving for another man while I was absent, the weight of my absence became even more apparent. The idea of spending a year in Korea had initially seemed like a worthwhile sacrifice for my career, but the toll it took on my family was immense. A year away from my wife and children felt like an eternity, a time I could never get back. This separation made me reconsider the strength of our marriage. I had thought it was unshakable, but now I was forced to confront the reality that we had nearly lost each other on more than one occasion. When the opportunity came to transfer to Army intelligence, I jumped at it. It meant fewer dangerous assignments and, importantly, more time at home. During my deployments to Iraq and Afghanistan, I felt a constant undercurrent of worry about what was happening back home. The statistics on military marriages were not encouraging, and the stories of failed relationships weighed heavily on me. Eventually, I realized that staying in a high-risk position might not be worth the slim chance of salvaging our marriage. Upon retiring, I found that a consulting job paid more than a potential general's salary would have. More importantly, it allowed me to be present for my daughter's senior year of high school and witness both of my children graduate. Reconnecting with my wife, Marcy, was priceless. She had continued her nursing education and had become the head nurse on the hospital's surgical team, which specialized in high-stakes procedures. At the hospital, there were 3 prominent neurosurgeons who stood out: an older doctor nearing retirement, a skilled woman in her 40s, and Dr. Trey Cardoza, a rising star who had joined the team that year. I had met Dr. Trey a few times at social events. He was tall, dark, and handsome, and exuded the kind of confidence that often bordered on arrogance. It was clear to me that he had taken an interest in Marcy, who, at 47, still maintained a physique that was the envy of many. I caught Dr. Trey giving Marcy lingering looks when he thought I wasn't around, which did little to ease my worries about their interactions at work. Marcy spoke highly of him, praising his skills and predicting he would become the next leader of the surgical team. The praise left me feeling uneasy, and when I confronted her about it, her response was hesitant. "I understand how you feel, Rick," Marcy said after a pause. "But this is my job. I have to work closely with these doctors, and frankly, they can be quite aggressive. Flirting is often a way to relieve stress in the operating room. It doesn't mean anything." I was troubled by her explanation. "But what about the time you spend with him? What about the lunches or the private conversations?" Marcy responded with a touch of sarcasm. "You remember how you were with that CIA woman before your deployment? I saw the way she looked at you. If I told her I didn't mind, she would have been all over you. It's the same here. If you trust me, you'll have to trust that nothing inappropriate happened." Months had passed since that conversation, and the question of Marcy's fidelity continued to hover over us like a dark cloud. The thought of what might have happened between her and Dr. Trey gnawed at me. Hospitals, with their numerous private rooms, offered plenty of opportunities for discretion, and my past experiences made me wary. Marcy's reassurance had to be taken at face value. I had to decide whether to trust her or let suspicion fester. Marcy's past offer from Deidre only complicated matters further. Deidre's advances had been clear, and Marcy was aware of them. The uncertainty was unsettling, but I had to make a choice. Either I trusted Marcy and accepted her explanations, or I let the doubt consume me. In the end, the decision was mine to make. The lingering question was whether I could put my trust in Marcy and move forward, or if the shadows of the past would continue to haunt our relationship. One day, after surviving a roadside ambush, Marcy and I found ourselves alone in an unoccupied office. We hadn't been in each other's company for 3 months, and despite the circumstances, I gave in to her advances. We were on the brink of taking things further when the sirens blared, signaling an attack on the base with mortar and rocket fire. The chaos interrupted us, and we took it as a clear sign to stay cautious. After that, we never contacted each other again. At first, I felt a pang of guilt, but then I recalled what Marcy had done while I was stationed in Korea. I told myself that if she could act on her impulses, then so could I. I convinced myself that it was just a meaningless fling, nothing more. Once I got back, everything would return to normal, and Marcy and I would be even. I was fooling myself. Here we were, two cheaters in a marriage trying to discuss trust. Given how attentive and loving Marcy had been lately, I decided I shouldn't dwell on the past. I had my own share of transgressions, and while I suspected she might have been unfaithful, I knew I wasn't without fault myself. Now, our entire team was heading to South America on a Doctors Without Borders mission. They were set to perform brain surgeries for underserved communities in 5 countries over nearly 6 weeks. Marcy was passionate about this trip and was determined not to give it up, despite knowing my reservations about Dr. Trey, one of the leading doctors on the tour. I had my own reasons for not wanting to stir up trouble, given how much the mission supported my military career. Marcy's departure was tense. She spent a considerable amount of time the previous evening packing and chatting with her mother on the phone, which I found intrusive, especially since it encroached on our dwindling intimate moments. I went to bed with a sense of annoyance simmering beneath the surface. The next morning, I awoke to find Marcy gone, no message, no goodbye kiss, nothing. I scanned the house for any note she might have left but found nothing. I checked my phone for messages but saw none. To say I was annoyed and concerned would be an understatement. I was furious. After making myself a cup of coffee and trying to calm down, I checked her flight status. She was en route to Colombia, their first stop on the tour. I hoped she would reach out from there. Yet, as hours passed with no word, my anxiety grew. I sent a brief message, "Hope you are okay." But no response came. The following day and the one after that passed in silence. Running had always been my escape, and I threw myself into it with renewed intensity. As I pounded the pavement, my frustration and anger fueled my pace. By the time I finished my run, I was gasping for breath. "Rick, are you okay?" A familiar voice called out. I looked up to see Vincent Nen from the house behind ours. His young wife, Leslie, was nearby, tending to a flower bed. I managed a nod and a weak smile in response to Vincent's knowing look. "Nice view, huh?" he said with a significant grin. I was too preoccupied to fully process the situation. "I'm tired from my run and need a shower," I replied. "Maybe another time." "Of course," Vincent said. "Leslie and I would love to have you over. We could grill some steaks and have a 6-pack of beer or some wine if you're up for it." "Thanks," I said, "I'll let you know." As I headed to my door, Vincent's strange smile lingered in my mind. After a refreshing shower and a cold drink, I sat in our empty house, the hum of the TV filling the silence. It was dark outside, and still no call, text, or email from Marcy. Frustrated, I decided to call the hotel where she was staying. After checking the time, I realized it was around 10 p.m. I was transferred to her room, but there was no answer. "Sorry, Senor," said the hotel manager with a thick accent, "it seems there is no answer." I felt a growing sense of unease. Who was Marcy with? Where was she? And why wasn't she reaching out? The silence was deafening, and the more I tried to reach her, the more questions and doubts consumed me. Pablo Espinosa, hotel manager. "At your service, sir," the manager said with a courteous nod. "Hello, Pablo. I'm Rick Weston. I need to find my wife, Marcy. I haven't been able to reach her since she left. Can you confirm if she checked into your hotel?" I asked, my voice tinged with anxiety. "Yes, Senor Weston," Pablo replied. "Mrs. Weston arrived earlier with her medical team. I saw her in the dining room with them. They had just returned from the hospital after a long day of surgery. They seemed quite exhausted, had a quick meal, and then went upstairs. "Can you do me a favor, Pablo?" I asked, my urgency growing. "Of course, sir," Pablo said, his tone shifting from polite to more attentive. "What do you need?" "Do you know Dr. Trey Cardoza's room number?" I asked. "Room 514, Señor," Pablo answered. "Would you like me to call him for you?" I felt a jolt of tension when I noticed Marcy's room number was 515. "Not right now, Pablo. One more thing, can you call Mrs. Penny Washington's room? Penny and Marcy are close, we had dinner with her and her husband, Josh, last August." After a brief pause, Pablo replied, "Certainly, Señor. Please hold for a moment." I heard some music play as he made the call. "Hi, Rick," Penny's voice came through the line. She sounded like she was expecting me, which made me wonder if Pablo had mentioned who was calling. "Hi Penny, sorry to bother you so late," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Is Josh okay?" Penny's response was quick and dismissive. "Why are you calling me? Is something wrong?" Ignoring her question, I pressed on. "I need to know where my wife is. I just checked the room list and saw that her room is next to Dr. Cardoza's. She's not there, and I have a strong feeling you know why." There was a brief pause before Penny's irritated tone came back. "Why are you asking me this? Don't play games with me, Penny. My wife's room is right next to Dr. Cardoza's, and I don't think that's a coincidence. I'm sure you're aware of what's going on. If you don't tell me where she is, I'm going to call your husband and let him know about the man in your room." Penny's voice dropped to a nervous whisper. "Please, Rick, don't involve Joshua. This is the first time this has happened. Don't do this. You can deny it all you want, but if you don't tell me where Marcy is, I will call your husband," I said firmly. The threat seemed to make her cooperative. "Okay, Rick, hold on," she said. I heard her cover the phone briefly before she spoke again. "I'm transferring you now." The phone rang in room 514. "Penny, why are you calling us?" Dr. Trey's voice came through, clearly expecting to speak to Penny. When he realized I was on the line, he seemed momentarily confused, but the gravity of the situation quickly set in. "This is Rick Weston. I need to speak to my wife," I said coldly. It took Trey a few seconds to respond, and his tone became smug. "Why should I put you through to her? Call Marcy now," I demanded. "If you value your career and your well-being, you'll do it. I'm not in the mood for games." I could hear a struggle on the other end, followed by the sound of a scuffle. Then Marcy's voice came through, sounding tired but resolute. "Give me the phone, Trey." There was a muttered curse from Trey before he left. For a long moment, the silence between Marcy and me was deafening. I tried to steady my breathing. "Rick," Marcy finally said, "I didn't expect us to have this conversation tonight, but it seems we have to." "Marcy, what are you doing in his room?" I asked, struggling to maintain composure. "Why haven't you answered my calls or messages?" She hesitated before speaking. "Can you give me a moment? Trey, can you leave us for a few minutes?" After a grumbled response from Trey, she continued. "Rick, this isn't what you think." I stayed silent, waiting for her to explain. The heaviness of the situation pressed down on me, and I braced myself for whatever she was about to say. I've learned from my time working with investigators that once criminals are caught, they often feel compelled to either confess or bolster their defenses. In a way, I suppose Marcy and I are no different. "Rick, I've always been a good wife and mother," she said on the phone, her voice steady but tinged with desperation. "I've done everything expected of me for us and for our children. I've been committed for years. Okay, I'll be back home in 6 weeks, and we can discuss what comes next. But just this once, during this time apart, please. Give me this one thing. If you don't mind. I was almost in shock. If I don't mind? I repeated, my voice trembling. You plan to call me after you and Trey have been intimate? I was incredulous. How convenient, Marcy replied, her tone defensive. You're upset because I've found someone else. And yes, Vincent and Leslie invited me to dinner. Leslie wants you. She wants to rock your world. I spoke with her about it, and she's okay with you going through with it. I'm not exactly an angel myself, you know. Is that so? I retorted. 24 years of marriage, and this is how you check out? You couldn't even muster the decency to tell me in person. Honey, we need to talk? All that would have done is start an argument before I left, Marcy said, her voice breaking. I wanted this. I need this experience at least once before I get older. I need to feel alive, just once, like a professional woman on her own. When you were in the army, you were alone and judged by your profession. I want that same feeling. And for Trey, that's just icing on the cake. I don't love him, for God's sake. He's just a toy. I left Leslie for you. What did you leave me for? I could hear her chuckling nervously on the other end. What can I say? I take care of my husband. Leslie's just turned 30, and you're 48. I'm giving you a 6-week hall pass with our 30-year-old roommate. How many women like Leslie are knocking on our door? So you've got me a woman while you deal with Dr. Trey. How thoughtful of you. Marcy, I said, barely containing my anger, sorry if I don't thank you. 6 weeks, and we'll be together again. I won't ask you about what happened, and neither will you ask me. Do you understand? I understand everything, she replied softly. I love you, Rick. I loved you too, Marcy, I said, my voice heavy with emotion. But now, I'm not so sure. I ended the call, not wanting to drag out the painful conversation any longer. Just then, the doorbell rang. I opened it to find Leslie standing there, a radiant smile on her face. I noticed she was alone, her husband, Vincent, was not with her. Good evening, Rick, she said, her smile dazzling. I couldn't help but be struck by how amazing she looked. Leslie wore minimal makeup, just enough to highlight her features. Her medium-length blonde hair framed her face, and her pink lipstick and matching eyeshadow added a touch of elegance. Her floral print sundress clung to her hourglass figure, and her heels accentuated her long legs and defined calf muscles. It was a young and healthy look that drew me in more than any outfit. Are you going to let me in? She asked, raising an eyebrow playfully. Of course, I said, stepping aside to let her enter. As I led her into the kitchen, I noticed she had brought a bottle of wine. She handed it to me with a smile. Red Moscato, she said. How did you know I liked it? A realization hit me, Marcy must have told her what to bring. I was hoping you'd want some company, Leslie said. I don't know how good company I'll be, I replied. But I do have a question. Where's Vincent? He went out with his friends to play cards, Leslie answered. As I poured her a glass of wine, I couldn't help but think about how Vincent had left his young wife alone. How many times had I left Marcy alone, giving in to temptation? Marcy was off in South America now, and Leslie had just mentioned speaking with her. Have you heard anything about Marcy? I asked as I poured. Leslie seemed taken aback. Oh, did I interrupt your conversation with her? I was just talking to Marcy when you knocked. No, not at all, I said. We said almost everything that needed to be said. She probably sensed my mood was off. Leslie looked at me with concern. Rick, I think we need to talk. Let's sit down. I motioned towards the living room, my mind racing as we moved to sit. Why don't you start? I said, frustration creeping into my voice. I was hoping Marcy would talk to you before she left, but apparently not. Instead, I'm left playing phone tag only to find out my wife is holed up with her doctor boyfriend in South America. Let's cut the games, tell me what you and Marcy had planned before she left. Leslie took a deliberate sip from her glass, seeming to gather her thoughts. Well, Rick, it all started a while back. We met in a shopping center and really hit it off. We ended up having a drink in our backyard one afternoon. I can't recall where you and Vincent were that day, but you know how it is, girls and drinks. We ended up chatting about my marriage and my husband's quirks. Leslie paused, as if weighing how much to reveal. I simply waited, silent and intense. She continued, you see, Rick, my husband enjoys sharing. I asked if I could share with you. I was a bit tipsy, but the truth is, I do find you attractive. However, I prefer older men. I was flattered by the attention, but I was also clear about my preferences. My mind was racing as I tried to process her words. So, you told Marcy about this? Yes, Leslie said, nodding. I was honest with her. I wanted her to know. But how did she take it? She seemed surprised, I admitted. Marcy never mentioned this to me. She must have been shocked. Leslie raised an eyebrow. Marcy didn't discuss this with you? That's surprising. She actually dropped a bombshell on me right before you arrived tonight. She seemed startled by the call. I took a sip of my drink, contemplating her revelations. Rick, you said you found out about Marcy and her doctor friend tonight. I wouldn't exactly call a man who sleeps with another man's wife a gentleman. I agree, I said. So, what's Vincent's role in all this? Leslie shrugged. Vincent knows I've been interested in you since you moved into our neighborhood. I hadn't had a regular lover for some time, and I was looking for one. We don't usually keep regular boyfriends. I had one before, but it was more about meeting new people. Vincent finds men online, and we meet them for dinner or drinks. If I like them, we go back to our place. And what does Vincent do while you're with these men? Vincent finds men who are willing to let him watch, Leslie explained casually. He likes to observe from a distance. It's safer that way. I shook my head, trying to wrap my mind around it all. How long have you two been doing this? About 4 years, she said nonchalantly, as if discussing the weather. And what about Marcy? I asked, trying to piece together the situation. Oh, Marcy, Leslie said with a smile. A few weeks ago, she came over and said she agreed to the arrangement, but only if she could do it with you while she was away with her surgical team. She didn't specify details about what or who she would be involved with while gone. But we women, we understand these things. I had a feeling she was easing her conscience by allowing me access to you. Leslie's words made me feel uneasy. You think she was compromising her conscience? Perhaps, Leslie said, shaking her head. Honestly, I wish she'd talked to you beforehand. I don't like this sneaky cheating stuff. I didn't know how to respond to that. Even Leslie seemed conflicted. I have something for you, she said suddenly, reaching into her purse. She pulled out an envelope and handed it to me. Marcy left this for you. I was supposed to give it to you. Read it if you want. I'm heading to the ladies' room. She gestured down the hallway with a nod. Thank you. I'll be back soon, she added with a smile before emptying her glass. The envelope was simple, marked only with the initials RKU. I took a deep breath and carefully opened it. As I began to read, Marcy's words unfolded. I've learned that once people are cornered, they often either come clean or defend their actions. It seems Marcy and I are no different. Rick, I've always tried to be a good wife and mother, Marcy said, her voice breaking with frustration. I've done everything expected of me for years. I've been loyal, even when I was lonely while you were away. But maybe I should have had affairs while you were off playing soldier. God knows I've suffered enough. Our kids needed 2 parents, and I tried to be both. But I'm not you. I needed my husband's touch, and I resisted temptation to stay faithful. It wasn't easy. Her voice grew more intense. When you were in Iraq, Deidre Klein came back before you did. She came to see me and smugly said she took care of you over there. She left before I could ask more, but when you came home, I knew exactly what she meant. Any doubts I had were erased when I saw the shame in your eyes. I know two wrongs don't make a right, Marcy continued, her voice trembling. Maybe you didn't do anything with her, and in that case, I'd be the first to admit to cheating with Trey. But I don't think that's true. I suspect you were the first to cross that line, whether it was before or during my affair. I'm tired of being the obedient wife waiting at home. When Leslie told me she was in love with you, I talked to both her and Vincent. He admitted they have an open marriage. So, it's not my conscience that's at stake here, only the fact that I've cheated on you. Marcy's tone grew resolute. So here's the deal, I'm going on this trip, and while I'm away, we are not married. You have a 6-week pass, and I'm giving myself one too. If we truly love each other, we'll be able to forget about this when I return. If not, I'll mourn what we had and what we lost. I'm not doing this because Trey seduced me or forced me, I'm doing it of my own free will. I find him attractive, even though I don't like him. She paused before adding, when I come back, I expect us to start over. If you're with Leslie, so be it. I'm still committed to you, despite everything. I loved being your wife and mother to your children, but after all these years, I need a break. Leslie is willing to spend a night with you, and Vincent would even pay you to let him watch. But it's your choice. Leslie won't leave Vincent for you, he allows her to be with other men. I doubt she wants to give that up. Marcy's final words were poignant. If you love someone, set them free, and if they return to you, they were always yours. I'll be back in 6 weeks. I love you always and forever. She added a postscript, Leslie should have been tested for STDs before she saw you. Make sure she shows you the results. Trey and I were both tested before we left. I'll get tested for you before I return and won't touch anyone else until we meet again. Please do the same. This will be our first sign of trust. I've booked a room for us at the Ambassador Hotel near the airport. If you want to meet me, be there 2 hours after my flight is due. Please don't come to the airport or make a scene. I'll meet you at the hotel, and I'll be waiting in the lobby. After finishing Marcy's letter, I noticed Leslie pouring herself another glass of wine. Are you okay? She asked. I will be, I replied. Leslie nodded and returned to sit beside me, refilling my glass. She looked at me with deep, thoughtful eyes. So, Rick, what do we do now? I met her gaze, feeling a mix of gratitude and resolve. Thank you for delivering Marcy's letter. I hate what she wrote, but I appreciate you bringing it to me. As for what we do now, we do nothing. I'm attracted to you, but I won't be one of your lovers. Despite spending years away in the army, I remained faithful to my wife, with only one unfortunate lapse. I won't give Marcy the same free rein she's taken with Trey. With that, I stood up, took my glass of wine, and walked into the kitchen. I poured the wine down the sink, and Leslie just watched, her expression a mix of surprise and confusion. I could tell she was taken aback by my response. She seemed used to men falling at her feet, but my reaction left her stunned and uncertain. When Leslie continued to sit there without saying anything, I took the bottle of wine, reinserted the cork, and handed it to her. Leslie, thank you again for delivering Marcy's letter and for your offer, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Leslie finally understood the gravity of the situation and what my actions meant. She stood up, trying her best to be seductive, but I had no desire to continue this conversation. She began to speak, but I cut her off. I'm devastated by Marcy's actions. I need some time alone to process what this means for me. I escorted her to the door and handed her the remaining bottle of wine she had brought. As she turned to say something, I slowly closed the door. I wasn't trying to be rude, but I needed to focus on my own feelings right now. Having spent nearly 30 years in the military, especially in intelligence, I had built a network of contacts and resources. I began to reflect on the mistakes I had made with Marcy. First and foremost, I should have had a serious conversation with her about her behavior while I was stationed in Korea. Despite her assurances of fidelity, I never addressed the issue of her arriving 2 hours early for her shifts. My failure to confront this matter had affected me more deeply than I had anticipated. Second, I needed to be honest about my own shortcomings in Iraq. I had been too ashamed of my actions to confide in her. I should have come clean as soon as I returned home. Now I learned that Deidre had said something to Marcy, giving her an excuse to start an affair with Trey. Marcy had asked me about Deidre 4 months ago, and I had continued to lie. As she mentioned in her letter, Marcy had become convinced that I was dishonest with her. Third, I was aware of something going on between Marcy and Trey, but I chose not to press the issue. My own shame about my actions and Marcy's probing questions about Deidre silenced me. She exploited my inability to be honest, which allowed her to continue the affair in secret. I reread Marcy's letter. My initial impression had been that it was self-serving and filled with excuses for her infidelity. Reading it again, my perception hadn't changed, but it did reinforce the reality that the woman I once loved, the woman with whom I raised our children and envisioned growing old, was gone. In her place was someone I no longer recognized or loved. I had loved her for the sake of our children and didn't want to see her hurt, but deep down, I knew our marriage was over. I could never forgive her, nor could I trust her again. What struck me the most was her sense of entitlement. After 24 years together, how could she think I would accept her betrayal so easily? Her sense of self-worth was astounding. She genuinely believed she deserved the life she was living. Her statement that she was tired of being the obedient wife while I served as a war hero was infuriating. It was a complete contradiction. She knew who I was and what I did when we married. It was no secret that my life was difficult, but we had faced it together. Did she think I enjoyed being away from my family? Did she believe I liked the fieldwork and combat? I had turned down a promotion to general to protect our marriage from the pressures it would bring. How could she have thought that continuing this charade would be sustainable? Her decision to leave without properly saying goodbye, wanting to be fresh for Dr. Trey, and her complete silence until I forced the issue, made it clear that she no longer cared about me or my feelings. She didn't respect me. What I had thought was priceless was now revealed to be worthless in her eyes. She wanted a break from us and, it seemed, a permanent vacation from our life together. It was time to take action and move forward without her. The following morning, I woke up with a clear mission. I had a network of contacts, and it was time to leverage them. I started my day with a vigorous run and a hearty breakfast before calling my office to let them know I'd be taking a few days off. Having witnessed the unraveling of numerous marriages during my military career, I had a solid grasp of what I needed to do to end this one. First on my list was reaching out to an old Army buddy, Jackson Steele. Jackson had served with the Jaguar Corps before retiring and transitioning into private practice. I briefed him on the situation, Marcy's infidelity, the turmoil, and what I hoped to achieve. Jackson connected me with a divorce lawyer he highly recommended. I made an appointment for the next day and received a list of documents I needed to bring from her secretary. Before diving into the paperwork, I paid off our joint credit cards and canceled them. Since Marcy had a card in her name, I knew she wouldn't be inconvenienced. Next, I withdrew half of the money from our savings and checking accounts, ensuring my name was removed from these accounts. I also emptied our safe of all important documents and valuables. I opened new bank accounts in my name only and acquired a personal safe. After sorting out my finances, I headed to the HR department at my company. Although I was a consultant, my work had deep ties with federal contracts. I updated my life insurance policy and 401k beneficiaries to my children, ensuring that if something happened to me before the divorce was finalized, Marcy wouldn't benefit. I called Jackson back to inform him I'd changed my will to leave everything to our children and had appointed him as the executor of my estate. I was surprised at how much I managed to accomplish in one day. Instead of resting, I began packing. It was eye-opening to realize how many things had lost their value to me, likely because they were tainted by Marcy's actions. I left everything behind for her. If she didn't need them, she could dispose of them. The next day, I met with Lisa Davis, the lawyer Jackson had recommended. She was personable and exuded a quiet confidence that reassured me. After handing over all the requested documents in Marcy's letter, Lisa reviewed everything meticulously. She compiled a worksheet and asked detailed questions about what I wanted to do with our shared assets. I requested to sell the house and divide the equity. If Marcy was interested, she could buy out my share. I also wanted our joint investment account to be split. I aimed to be as fair as possible, despite the hurt Marcy had caused me. Lisa inquired about whether I wanted to pursue any legal action against the hospital or Trey. I declined, preferring to avoid additional conflicts. In the following weeks, I rented an apartment and finished packing my belongings. There wasn't much to take, just my personal clothing and a few mementos from my Army career. Lisa arranged for a company to document and appraise everything in the house to ensure a fair settlement. I also discussed taking more out-of-town and overseas assignments with my boss, given that my daughter was in the Navy and my son was in college. With nothing anchoring me here, it felt like the right move. As Marcy's return approached, I prepared everything for the divorce. The papers were ready for her signature, and all my belongings were packed and stored in the garage, awaiting the move to my new apartment. I furnished it with essentials, stocked it with food, and filled it with most of my clothes. I maintained a facade of normalcy, engaging in my usual activities to keep up appearances. My neighbors had no clue about the changes brewing in my life. I encountered Vince and Leslie a few times. I kept interactions brief and polite, making it clear I didn't have time for extended conversations. On one occasion, when Vince approached me, I politely brushed him off, saying I had to leave and didn't have time to talk. That evening, as I settled into my new routine, I felt a mix of relief and apprehension. The path forward was uncertain, but I was ready to face it, step by step. Leslie reached out to me, but I let her call go to voicemail and deleted it without listening. I didn't need to hear anything she might have said, nothing could have been important at that moment. A week later, out of the blue, I received a call from an overseas number. Recognizing it as Marcy's, since both our cell phones had international plans, I was surprised she didn't use that line to reach me sooner. In her brief message, Marcy asked me to call her back. She mentioned that cell coverage was poor, but she needed to talk to me. She didn't specify the reason, only that the conversation was important. I chose not to return her call. I felt there was nothing she could say that I wanted to hear. 3 days later, Marcy called again. This time, she expressed deep concern about me and insisted that we needed to talk. I was baffled by her urgency but chose to ignore the call again. She wanted a break from us, and I had obliged. That evening, Vince and Leslie showed up at my door, but I didn't even bother to open it. The next day, I waited until most neighbors had gone to work and then called a small moving company. I instructed them to pick up the boxes I had packed in the garage. It took about 20 minutes to load everything onto their truck. My remaining belongings, like toiletries and clothes, were already in my car. I moved out and was away for work for the next week. I'm sure my absence from the house didn't go unnoticed. Leslie called me again, but I told her I was out of town and didn't have time to chat. We didn't discuss anything further. Throughout this time, I stayed in touch with my children, parents, and relatives. They reached out to make sure I was okay, knowing Marcy was out of the country. I made it a point to reassure everyone that I was managing just fine. I received yet another call from Marcy, but I ignored it and didn't even listen to the voicemail. I realized that my handling of the situation might seem clinical, but the truth is, I was deeply devastated by Marcy's actions. Her betrayal crushed me. The shock and anger I felt after discovering her affair, reading her letter, and reflecting on her behavior turned into profound sadness. Marcy had changed so much, and her cavalier attitude towards me and my feelings showed she truly believed she deserved what she did, regardless of the impact on others. During my time in intelligence, I worked closely with special operators, providing them with critical information. I had contacts and made friends with some very serious and intimidating individuals, people who were as deadly as any on Earth. Given the nature of my work, I maintained semi-regular contact with several of these operators. A week before Marcy's return, I reached out to one of them using a number he had given me for emergencies. I dialed the number but hung up without leaving a message. A few minutes later, he called me back, and we had a brief conversation before I hung up. Later that day, I met this contact at a small biker bar about 50 miles from my hometown. I provided him with Marcy's name, photo, and address, explaining what I wanted done. I ended by saying, "It's a hospital, not a morgue." When Marcy returned, I sent out an email to my entire family and a few close friends. In the email, I confessed my sole failure in Iraq and took responsibility for my mistakes. I also included a copy of Marcy's letter. While I wasn't aiming to go scorched earth, I wanted everyone to know I had filed for divorce and the reasons behind it. Before sending it to everyone, I sent it to my kids first. I called them to explain everything that was happening. I didn't want them to be blindsided, and they deserved to know the full story. Both were heartbroken over the divorce and Marcy's actions. Rhonda, especially, was furious with her mother. "I can't believe Mom turned into this person," she yelled into the phone. "What the hell is she thinking? She was a role model for me, and now she's showing her worst side." I started to respond but realized she was simply venting her frustration. Exhausted and emotionally drained, I chose to bypass further confrontation and instead expressed my love and understanding to my children, Kyle and Emma. I assured them that despite the turmoil, we would navigate through this challenging time together. "I don't fully grasp what your mother is doing," I admitted, "but there's nothing more I can say or do. I no longer trust her, and I can't accept her actions. She's shown herself to be incredibly selfish, unconcerned with the impact on others. As a result, I'm stepping away from her to pursue the life she's chosen." Kyle's reaction was blunt. "I think Mom's lost her mind. There's no other explanation for her behavior." Emma remained silent, her disappointment evident. With nothing more to discuss, we exchanged farewells and ended the call. Next, I reached out to both sets of parents and other relatives. Marcy's parents were particularly disheartened. They were decent people, and their pain was palpable. I could only present Marcy's letter as a testament to her attitude and decisions. Despite their shock and concern, I reassured them that counseling wouldn't resolve anything. It was clear that both families were deeply hurt by the unfolding events. These calls were made from the airport, just before I boarded a plane for an overseas assignment. For the next 2 months, Marcy wouldn't see me at the hotel or anywhere else. She was expecting to see me, but I was already en route, leaving behind the chaos and heartache. The next day, tensions flared when the surgical team returned to the airport. Josh, Penny's husband, was there to meet her and immediately confronted her with accusations. Furious and demanding to know who she had been with, he lashed out. I had called him earlier, informing him about Penny's infidelities. He had the right to know who his wife was involved with. Josh wasn't alone. Several other members of the club, both men and women, faced similar confrontations. Josh made it his mission to broadcast Penny's affairs, contacting everyone he knew and seeking out details of her indiscretions. Dr. Trey, who had tried to steer clear of the drama, found himself in an untenable position. His girlfriend, who was infuriated by Marcy's involvement with him, physically attacked both him and Marcy at the airport. She had to be restrained from causing further harm. In addition, several hospital staff members and representatives from Doctors Without Borders were present, eager to understand what had transpired during the trip. Josh's threats of lawsuits gained considerable attention, further escalating the situation. It took about 10 minutes for the chaos to subside, thanks to police intervention and the separation of the various parties involved. Hospital administrators quickly took the team aside and informed them that they were required at the hospital the following morning for a comprehensive briefing. Their continued work would hinge on the outcomes of this meeting. As the airport scene settled, a man dressed as a limousine driver approached Marcy. "Are you Marcy Weston?" he asked. Marcy, looking bewildered, confirmed her identity. The driver handed her a large manila envelope and said, "You've been served. Colonel Weston also left a message for you, you're free." With that, he left Marcy in stunned silence. I switched off the live feed, choosing to move forward with my life. However, this wasn't the end of the turmoil. Later that evening, Dr. Trey returned home, seething with anger over the public exposure of his affair. His evening was about to take a drastic turn for the worse. He became the victim of a brutal home invasion. The last thing he remembered was being shocked as he entered his house. When he woke up days later in the hospital, he was battered and broken, his nose and left orbital bone were fractured, several teeth were lost, and his left hand was crushed. His right arm and hand were similarly damaged, and his home was left in shambles. A message was spray-painted on a blank wall: "Don't mess with married women." Reflecting on these events, consider this: would you agree to this kind of relationship? Would you respond the same way as your spouse? Share your thoughts in the comments. See you in the next chapter.